In the far reaches of the galaxy, humanity had carved out its place among the stars. The galaxy was vast, teeming with life, with countless alien species that humanity had come to know, some as allies, others as adversaries. Among these, one name struck fear into the hearts of many: the Zalriks. The Zalriks were warriors, bred and engineered for combat, with bodies built to withstand the harshest conditions and minds honed for battle. Their reputation was one of savagery, a species that showed no mercy, seeking only conquest and destruction. For centuries, they had raided planets, laying waste to entire colonies, leaving only ruin in their wake. Many species, including humans, avoided direct conflict with them, knowing the brutality that awaited any who stood in their way. But even within their culture, there were unspoken codes. To die in battle was considered the ultimate honor. Yet, being left behind by one's comrades, abandoned, discarded, was a fate worse than death. On a desolate, war-torn planet, the Zalriks had mounted yet another invasion. This time, however, they had met their match. The resistance was fierce, and in the chaos of the failed attack, one warrior had been gravely injured. Turok, a seasoned Zalriks fighter, lay amidst the debris, his once powerful form now broken, bloodied. His comrades, seeing him as too injured to continue, had abandoned him without a second glance. To the Zalriks, weakness was death. And Turok, in their eyes, was already dead. Turok lay still, his breath shallow, his vision blurring. The pain was unbearable, but worse than that was the sense of betrayal. Left to die on a planet far from home, discarded by the very warriors he had fought beside. He should have felt anger, but instead, there was only numbness. The cold embrace of death was closing in, and Turok welcomed it. Better to die here than suffer the indignity of being left behind. But death would not come quickly. Hours passed, the twin suns of the planet setting on the horizon, casting long shadows across the battlefield. Turok's consciousness flickered in and out, each moment more agonizing than the last. He could feel his body shutting down, the end creeping closer with every passing second. And then, he heard footsteps. Faint at first, but growing louder, closer. Turok tensed, instinctively trying to move, but his body betrayed him. He was helpless, vulnerable, a state that was utterly foreign to him. The footsteps drew nearer, and through his fading vision, Turok could make out a figure. Humanoid, but smaller than a Zalrik's. A human. Eli Morgan, a medic working with the humanitarian forces, was making his rounds through the battlefield. His mission was simple: provide aid to any survivors, regardless of species. He had been a soldier once, fighting in wars just like this one. But after witnessing the devastation and suffering on countless worlds, he had traded his rifle for a medit. Now, his sole purpose was to save lives, even in the most hostile of places. As he moved through the debris, his eyes caught something unusual: movement, faint but unmistakable. He approached cautiously, his hand resting on the pistol at his side, ready for anything. And then he saw it, a Zalrik's, lying on the ground, barely clinging to life. Eli froze. Every instinct told him to turn around, to leave the alien where it lay. The Zalriks were dangerous, ruthless. Everyone knew that. But as he looked closer, he saw the extent of the creature's injuries. It was dying, and it wouldn't be long before it succumbed to its wounds. He should leave it. He should walk away. But he didn't. There was something about the sight of the fallen warrior that gave him pause. The Zalriks might be monsters in the eyes of many, but right now, this one was just dying. Alone. Abandoned. Eli felt a surge of something, pity perhaps, or maybe it was just the stubborn part of him that refused to let any living being die if he could help it. Against his better judgment, Eli knelt beside the wounded alien, carefully assessing its injuries. The damage was severe: broken bones, deep gashes, and internal bleeding. This Zalrik should have been dead by now. And yet, it clung to life. Eli hesitated, his hand hovering over his medkit. Was he really about to do this? Save an enemy? Every rational thought screamed at him to walk away. But as he looked at the alien, struggling for breath, something inside him made the decision. Hold on! Eli muttered, mostly to himself, as he began working on stabilizing the creature. Tarak's eyes flickered open for a brief moment, and he saw the human kneeling beside him, administering aid. Confusion washed over him. A human, helping him? It made no sense. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His body was too weak. All he could do was lie there, helpless, as the human worked. Eli worked quickly, his hands moving with practiced precision. He patched up the worst of the wounds, stopping the bleeding and administering pain relief. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep the Zalryx alive for now. As he finished, Eli sat back, wiping sweat from his brow. The alien was still alive, though barely. He wasn't sure why he had done it. Maybe it was just the medic in him, refusing to let anyone die. Or maybe it was something else, something about the way the Zalryx had been left behind, discarded like nothing. Tarak's breathing was still labored, but steady. For now, he was stable. Eli didn't know what would happen next. He didn't even know if the alien would survive the night. But for some reason, he felt like he had made the right choice, even if it didn't make sense. Eli sat there for a moment, staring at the injured Zalryx lying still, its massive body barely moving. His decision to help had already been made, but doubt lingered in his mind. Every fiber of his being told him this was a terrible idea. He knew what the Zalryx were capable of. They were killers bred for war. Yet, despite all the stories, he couldn't bring himself to abandon a living creature, even if that creature was one of the galaxy's most feared enemies. Eli shook his head, trying to push the fear aside. He had to focus. The alien was alive, but for how long? Without proper treatment, the bandages and makeshift splints he applied wouldn't hold up. Tarak's injuries were severe, and there was no one coming to help. He thought about radioing for support, but he knew what the response would be: leave it. Orders were orders, and helping an injured Zalryx wasn't in the mission protocol. A low growl broke his thoughts. Eli's head snapped toward the Zalryx. Tarak's eyes were open now, glowing faintly in the dim light. His gaze was fierce, filled with pain but also something else, rage, perhaps. The alien tried to move, but his body protested, and he let out a sharp, agonized breath. For a moment, Eli wondered if the creature would lash out. He had heard stories of Zalryx warriors attacking even when on the verge of death, preferring to die in combat rather than be seen as weak. "Easy," Eli said, his voice steady but quiet. "I'm not here to hurt you." Tarak's growl deepened, though it was weaker this time, more of a warning than a threat. Eli kept his hands visible, trying to convey that he wasn't an enemy. But the tension in the air was thick, and for a moment, Eli wasn't sure if the alien would listen. Tarak's eyes locked onto him, full of suspicion and mistrust. The Zalryx were known for their distrust of humans, viewing them as weak, fragile beings unworthy of respect. Eli could feel that weight in the creature's gaze. Still, he didn't move. Slowly, he knelt down again beside the alien, keeping his movements calm and deliberate. He could see the confusion in Tarak's expression. A Zalryx would never help a human, much less expect help in return. And yet here they were. Eli felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but he kept his voice soft, almost casual. "You're hurt pretty bad," Eli said, pointing to the hastily applied bandages. "I did what I could, but it's not enough. If you want to live, you'll need more help. And I can't do that if you don't let me." Tarak's eyes narrowed, but the growl subsided. He didn't speak, not yet, but something shifted in the tension between them. Eli could sense it. The Zalryx wasn't about to attack him, at least not right now. Maybe it was because Tarak was too weak, or maybe there was something more, something Eli couldn't quite put his finger on. Tarak tried to speak, his voice rough and strained. "Human." The word was barely a whisper, his vocal cords struggling to form the sounds. "Why?" Eli wasn't sure how to answer. Why was he doing this? Why risk his life for a creature that would likely kill him without hesitation if their roles were reversed? The truth was, Eli didn't have a clear answer. Maybe it was just who he was. Maybe it was because he had seen enough death in his time as a soldier. Or maybe it was because, in that moment, Turok didn't seem like the enemy he had always imagined the Zalriks to be. "You were left behind," Eli finally said, his voice low. "I couldn't just walk away." Turok's eyes flashed with something: anger, shame, maybe both. Abandonment was a dishonor among the Zalriks, a fate worse than death. To be left behind meant you were no longer considered a warrior, no longer worthy of your comrades. It was a betrayal of everything their culture stood for. Eli could see that understanding in Turok's eyes, and it hit him harder than he expected. Turok closed his eyes, his body shuddering slightly as the pain surged through him. He was still weak, his breath labored, but there was a resignation in his posture now. He wasn't fighting anymore, at least not physically. Eli took that as a sign to continue. He rummaged through his medkit, pulling out supplies for a more thorough treatment. This was going to take time, and they didn't have much of it. As Eli worked, he could feel Turok's gaze on him, watching his every move. There was no trust between them, not yet, but something had shifted. The initial hostility was gone, replaced by a silent understanding. Eli wasn't here to harm him, and Turok, for the moment, wasn't going to resist. It was a strange feeling, working so close to a creature that had been raised to view his kind as enemies. Eli had never been this close to a Zalriks before, and now that he was, he could see the subtle details that made them more than just the monsters they were painted to be. The scars, the muscle, the signs of countless battles fought and survived. Turok had been through more than most humans could imagine, and yet here he was, vulnerable, relying on the kindness of a stranger. When Eli finished applying the last of the bandages, he sat back, breathing heavily. He had done everything he could with what he had. It wasn't much, but it would keep the Zalriks alive for now. Turok's eyes flickered open again, and this time, they weren't filled with the same hostility as before. There was still suspicion, of course, there always would be, but there was something else too. Maybe a flicker of curiosity, or at least the absence of immediate danger. "Rest," Eli said quietly. "You need it." Turok didn't respond. Instead, he closed his eyes, his breathing slow and steady, though still shallow. Eli stayed beside him for a moment longer, unsure of what would happen next. Would Turok recover enough to become a threat? Would he even survive the night? The questions hung in the air, but for now, all Eli could do was wait. As the quiet settled over them, Eli found himself wondering about the creature beside him. The Zalriks were known for their ruthlessness, their dedication to war. But in this moment, stripped of his comrades and his strength, Turok didn't seem like the enemy. He just seemed like another life, one that had been abandoned, left to die. And for reasons Eli couldn't quite explain, that was enough to make him stay. Turok's eyes opened slowly, his vision still blurry, but the pain was more manageable now. He glanced around, disoriented, before his gaze settled on the human still sitting a few feet away. Eli was quietly cleaning his tools, focused but aware of the alien watching him. There was no fear in his posture, only calm. Turok didn't understand this human, why he had helped him, why he was still here. He should have left. The thought crossed Turok's mind again. Why hadn't the human abandoned him? No Zalriks would have stayed, not for an enemy, not for someone as close to death as he had been. Turok couldn't make sense of it. His kind had always been taught that humans were weak, their compassion a sign of their inferiority. Yet, this human had shown more strength than some of his own comrades. His throat still raw, Turok attempted to speak again, his voice rough but clearer than before. "You should not have helped." Eli looked up, pausing for a moment before responding. "Maybe not, but I did." The answer was simple, but it frustrated Turok. Nothing was ever that simple. His kind valued strength, power, and the survival of the fittest. This act of compassion, of staying when he should have left, was not something a warrior would do. And yet, Eli had done it without hesitation. "You risk your life, for nothing," Turok said, his voice growing stronger with each word. He wanted to understand, to push this human into explaining why he had defied all logic, all reason, by saving him. Eli shrugged, his expression thoughtful. Maybe it's nothing to you. But to me, it's about doing the right thing. I've seen enough death in my time. Didn't want to see another, not when I could do something about it. Turok remained silent, trying to process the human's words. They were alien to him, this notion of compassion in the face of danger. His entire life had been about proving his worth through combat, through survival. There was no place for mercy in his world. Eli returned to his task, adjusting the medkit and checking the supplies he had left. You're stable now, but you're not out of the woods yet. You'll need more time to heal. Turok wasn't sure what to make of that. The humans spoke to him as though they were equals, as though this strange encounter wasn't something exceptional. No fear, no hesitation. He hadn't expected that. I owe you nothing, Turok finally said, testing Eli's reaction. Eli didn't flinch, didn't seem surprised. Didn't ask for anything. You don't know me. But I'll stay until you can walk again, at least. I'm not just gonna leave you here. Turok didn't understand. The logic of the human's decision continued to baffle him. Why would anyone stay to help, especially without expecting something in return? In the Zalric's culture, everything was transactional. Aid was only given when it served a greater purpose, often power, alliances, or survival. This didn't fit into any of that. As the silence stretched between them, Turok became more aware of his surroundings. His body, though still in pain, felt stronger. The human's medical skills had clearly been more effective than he anticipated. There was no denying that Eli had saved him, though it made little sense. Turok shifted slightly, grimacing as a jolt of pain shot through his side. Eli noticed and reached for a pain injector, holding it out. Turok hesitated before accepting it. Trust did not come easily to his kind, especially not with a human. But in that moment, he realized he had no choice. This human, weak by Zalric's standards, had kept him alive. That was undeniable. You are not like the others, Turok muttered, his voice low but filled with something like reluctant respect. He didn't say it as a compliment, but as an observation. Eli raised an eyebrow, curious. Other humans, you mean? Turok nodded slightly. Weak. Fragile. Yet you stay. Eli leaned back, considering his words. Maybe it's because I've seen enough to know that strength isn't just about power. Sometimes it's about making choices that don't make sense to others. I didn't stay because I'm strong. I stayed because it felt right. This time, Turok didn't argue. There was a truth to Eli's words that he couldn't deny, though it conflicted with everything he had ever known. The Zalrics didn't value emotions, didn't believe in bonds forged from anything other than battle. Yet here he was, alive because of a human's compassion. A distant noise caught Turok's attention, his senses still sharp despite his weakened state. Eli heard it too, and he stiffened. It was faint, but unmistakable, the sound of movement. Someone, or something, was nearby. The tension returned, and Eli's hand instinctively moved toward his sidearm. Turok tried to sit up, but his body protested, sending another wave of pain through him. He cursed under his breath, frustrated by his weakness. He had always prided himself on his strength, on being able to fight through anything. Now, he was forced to rely on this human for protection. It was a bitter pill to swallow. Eli stood, scanning the horizon. Stay still. I'll check it out. Turok didn't argue. He was in no position to fight, and Eli seemed capable enough. It was a strange feeling, trusting a human, but Turok found himself with no other choice. As Eli moved cautiously, Turok watched him, his mind racing with questions. This human had saved him, had shown a kind of strength that was foreign to his people. Turok wasn't sure what to make of it, but he couldn't deny the strange sense of respect growing within him. Minutes passed, and Eli returned, his expression tense but calm. We're clear for now, but we can't stay here much longer. There are patrols sweeping the area. If they find us, it won't end well. Turok grunted in acknowledgement, knowing the human was right. He needed time to recover, But time wasn't something they had in abundance. His mind raced, trying to find a solution, but nothing came. He was at the mercy of this human's choices, and for the first time in his life, that didn't terrify him. "Then we move," Turok said, though his body protested the idea. "I will not die here." Eli nodded, as if understanding the unspoken determination in the alien's voice. He began gathering their supplies, moving quickly but efficiently. Turok watched him, still trying to understand this human who had defied every expectation, every stereotype. In that moment, Turok realized something profound, something he hadn't considered before. Perhaps humans were weak in many ways. But maybe, just maybe, there was a strength in them that the Zalriks had never seen. A strength that came not from power or dominance, but from the choice to stand by those who couldn't fight for themselves. And that, Turok thought, was a strength worth respecting. The quiet didn't last long. Eli had just packed the last of his gear when a sharp crack echoed through the air. His heart jumped as he recognized the sound: gunfire. They were being hunted, and whoever it was, they were getting closer. Turok's eyes snapped open, fully alert. The Zalriks could sense danger as well as any soldier, and his instincts told him they didn't have much time. He struggled to push himself up, but his body protested every movement. His pride wanted him to stand and fight, but the truth was undeniable: he was still too weak. Eli turned to him. "We need to go, now." Turok grunted in acknowledgement, though he knew he was in no condition to walk far, let alone fight. But this human wasn't abandoning him. It was absurd. No one would have blamed Eli for leaving him behind, but the human was still there, standing between him and certain death. They moved as quickly as Turok's injuries would allow. Eli kept looking over his shoulder, scanning for signs of the incoming threat. The sound of footsteps, crunching through the debris, was growing louder. Whoever was after them wasn't far now. Suddenly, a voice rang out in the distance. "We know you're here! Come out, and we might let you live!" Eli's jaw tightened. They had been found. He glanced at Turok, who was still struggling to keep pace, his breathing labored. There was no way they could outrun their pursuers. Eli knew what had to happen next, even if he didn't like it. "Hide here," Eli whispered, helping Turok down behind the wreckage of a nearby vehicle. "I'll draw them away." Turok glared at him, eyes filled with indignation. "You think I need to hide?" Eli didn't back down. "You can't fight in this condition. We don't have time to argue. Let me handle this." The alien growled but didn't argue further. He hated the idea of relying on a human, of hiding like a coward, but there was no denying the truth. His body wasn't ready for combat, and every second spent debating was a second closer to death. Eli moved quickly, disappearing into the shadows. Turok watched him go, his mind conflicted. The human had saved his life, and now he was willing to risk it again. It made no sense. No Zalriks would sacrifice themselves for someone else, least of all a human. Yet Eli's actions weren't driven by fear or survival instinct. They were driven by something else. Something Turok couldn't quite comprehend. The footsteps drew closer, and Turok tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward the weapon at his side. He couldn't see much from his position, but he could hear the hunters, at least 3 of them, closing in on Eli's position. A sharp whistle pierced the air. One of the hunters shouted, "Over there! Spread out!" Turok listened intently, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't just sit here while the human risked his life. Weak as he was, there was still something he could do. He forced his body to move, crawling toward the edge of the wreckage, just in time to see Eli dart from cover, drawing the attention of the hunters. Gunfire erupted, but Eli moved with the precision of someone who had been in this situation too many times before. He wasn't trying to engage them directly, just keep them busy long enough for Turok to recover, to figure out an escape plan. It was reckless, brave, and entirely in line with everything Turok had come to expect from this strange human. But it wasn't enough. Turok's sharp vision caught the movement before Eli did, one of the hunters circling around, taking position to flank him. Eli wouldn't see it coming, not until it was too late. Turok's muscles burned with effort, his body protesting every movement, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. With a final push, Turok forced himself to his feet, staggering but upright. He gripped the nearest weapon tightly, one of the crude but effective blasters left behind by his fallen comrades, and took aim. His hand shook, the pain nearly overwhelming, but his focus remained unshaken. The shot rang out, and the flanking hunter fell. Eli glanced back, eyes wide with surprise, but he didn't have time to react. More gunfire erupted, and he dove for cover, narrowly avoiding the barrage of bullets. Turok gritted his teeth, pushing through the pain as he fired again. His body screamed for him to stop, but he refused to yield. The hunters were caught off guard, their attention split between Eli and the unexpected threat of a wounded Zalrix. It was the opening they needed. Eli took advantage of the distraction, moving quickly and efficiently. Within moments he had closed the distance, taking out one of the remaining hunters with a swift, precise shot. The last one, panicked and outnumbered, turned to flee, but Turok's shot found its mark before the hunter could take more than a few steps. The silence that followed was deafening. Eli stood there for a moment, catching his breath, before turning to face Turok. The Zalrix was still standing, barely, but his breathing was ragged, and it was clear that he wouldn't last much longer without help. Eli rushed over, kneeling beside him. "You shouldn't have moved," he said, though there was no anger in his voice, just concern. Turok gave a weak, humorless laugh. "I am not weak." Eli smiled faintly, shaking his head. "No, you're not." They didn't have time for rest. More would come, and Eli knew it. But for now, they had survived, and that was more than either of them had expected when the day began. He quickly checked Turok's wounds, his brow furrowed with concern. The Zalrix was strong, but even he had his limits, and they were dangerously close to being reached. "We need to move," Eli said softly. "You saved me back there. Now let's make sure it wasn't for nothing." Turok didn't respond, but the look in his eyes said enough. He was exhausted, on the brink of collapse, but he wasn't done fighting yet. Not as long as there was still a chance, however slim, that they could make it out alive. With Eli's help, Turok managed to stand, leaning heavily on the human for support. Together they moved away from the battlefield, their steps slow but determined. The bond between them, forged in blood and fire, had grown stronger with every challenge they faced. For the first time in his life, Turok realized that perhaps there was more to strength than he had been taught. Perhaps strength wasn't just about power or dominance. Perhaps it was about standing beside someone when you didn't have to, when the odds were against you. And maybe, just maybe, that was something worth fighting for. The world around them was eerily silent as Eli and Turok made their slow retreat, but they both knew the quiet wouldn't last. The skirmish had bought them time, but not enough. Their enemies would return, and next time, they would come with reinforcements. Every step was a struggle, each breath heavy with the weight of exhaustion and pain. Turok's injuries, though treated, still throbbed, and Eli could feel the tension in the alien's body as they pressed on. They had no clear destination, just the instinct to survive, to keep moving until they found some semblance of safety. But in a world as hostile as this, safety felt like a distant dream. The barren landscape stretched endlessly, offering little in the way of cover or refuge. Eli's mind raced, trying to think of their next move, but the reality of their situation was grim. He glanced at Turok, whose stoic expression betrayed little of the pain he was surely feeling. There was a grim determination in his eyes, a refusal to give in, no matter the cost. "You should have left me," Turok rasped, breaking the silence. His voice was rough, each word strained. Eli didn't slow his pace, didn't even turn his head. "Not my style." Turok gave a low grunt, something that might have been a laugh if it hadn't been laced with pain. "Foolish," he muttered, though the word lacked the usual disdain. "Maybe," Eli replied. "But it's worked so far." There was no retort. Turok simply pressed on, his focus narrowing to the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other. His body was screaming at him to stop, to rest, but there was no time for that. Not yet. His mind wandered, though, back to the fight, to the way the human had moved without hesitation, had risked his life without question. It was unfamiliar. Among the Zalriks, trust was a rare commodity, earned only through shared bloodshed and victory. But this human had shown trust from the beginning, an odd, reckless trust that defied everything Turok had ever known. Finally, after what felt like hours of walking, Eli stopped, scanning their surroundings. They had reached the edge of a ravine, a natural barrier that could offer some protection, at least for a while. Eli nodded toward it. "We'll take cover down there. It's not perfect, but it'll do." Turok didn't argue. He had no strength left for debate. They descended into the ravine slowly, carefully, the jagged rocks offering some semblance of shelter. Once they were settled, Eli knelt beside Turok, checking his bandages. The bleeding had stopped, but infection was a constant threat. Turok watched him work, his mind still grappling with the human's actions. This was not how enemies treated each other. This was something else. "Why?" Turok finally asked, his voice low but demanding. "Why risk everything for me?" Eli paused, his hands still for a moment. He had expected the question, but the answer wasn't simple. He sat back on his heels, looking at Turok with a thoughtful expression. "I don't know," he admitted after a moment. "I guess it just felt like the right thing to do." Turok's eyes narrowed. "Right. You would die for something so meaningless?" Eli shrugged. "To you, maybe. But I've seen too much death, too much suffering. If I can save someone, I'll do it. Doesn't matter who." The words hung in the air, and Turok could feel the sincerity in them. This human wasn't like the others he had encountered. He didn't act out of fear, or duty, or even survival instinct. He acted out of something else, something Turok had no name for. It was strange, unsettling even, but it was also admirable. In a way. "You are different," Turok muttered, almost to himself. Eli smiled faintly. "So I've been told." Silence fell between them again, but this time it was less tense, more contemplative. Turok could feel his body relaxing, the adrenaline from the fight fading, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. He closed his eyes, just for a moment, and let his mind drift. But the quiet didn't last. A faint sound reached their ears, a distant hum, like the low thrum of an approaching engine. Eli's eyes snapped open, his body tensing. He knew that sound. It was a search party, and it was heading their way. Turok opened his eyes, sensing the change in the human's posture. "They are coming," he said, his voice steady despite the situation. Eli nodded grimly. "Yeah. And they'll be here soon." Turok tried to move, but his body wouldn't cooperate. His limbs felt heavy, his vision blurred. He was too weak, too drained from the previous fight. He could hear Eli moving beside him, checking his weapon, preparing for another battle. "You cannot fight them alone," Turok said, though he knew the human already understood that. Eli didn't respond immediately. He was focused, his mind already running through the possible outcomes. None of them were good. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and resolute. "I'll do what I have to. You just stay down." Turok gritted his teeth, frustration boiling beneath the surface. He was a warrior, a Zalrix. He didn't hide, didn't let others fight his battles. But he was powerless, and the reality of that cut deeper than any physical wound. As the hum grew louder, Eli positioned himself between Turok and the approaching danger. It was a simple act, but one that spoke volumes. Turok watched him, his mind racing. This human, this fragile, weak creature, was willing to stand against insurmountable odds, not for glory or power, but simply because he refused to abandon a life. It was madness. And yet, in that madness, Turok found something he hadn't expected. Respect. "I will not let you die here," Turok growled, his voice filled with a sudden surge of determination. Eli glanced back, surprised by the intensity in the alien's voice. "I wasn't planning on it." Turok's grip tightened on his weapon, the pain in his body momentarily forgotten. His mind cleared, and for the first time since this ordeal began, he felt a sense of clarity. He understood now. This human wasn't weak. His strength came from something deeper, something more powerful than physical prowess. And in that moment, Turok made a choice. Together then, he said, his voice firm. Eli hesitated for a split second, then nodded. Together. The search party was close now, and there was no more time for words. Eli raised his weapon, his body tense but ready. Turok did the same, ignoring the throbbing pain in his limbs. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and exhausted. But they weren't alone. Not anymore. As the first of the searchers came into view, Eli fired, the shot ringing out in the still air. Turok followed, his own blast ripping through the enemy ranks. The fight was brutal, fast, and chaotic, but there was a rhythm to it, a strange, unspoken coordination between the two of them. They fought as one, human and Zalrix, their differences forgotten in the heat of battle. And for the first time in his life, Turok felt something he had never known before. Pride. Not in himself, but in the bond they had forged. The fight ended as quickly as it had begun. The searchers lay defeated, their bodies scattered across the ravine. Eli stood breathing heavily, his weapon still raised, his body tense. Turok lowered his blaster, his chest heaving with exhaustion, but there was a fierce light in his eyes. They had survived. Against all odds, they had won. Eli turned to Turok, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Not bad. Turok grunted, though there was a hint of amusement in his tone. You fought well, for a human. Eli laughed, the sound surprising even him. And you're not so bad for a Zalrix. For a moment, they simply stood there, side by side, united not by species or culture, but by something deeper. Something stronger. And in that moment, they both knew that whatever came next, they would face it together.